Okay, well, thank you guys for coming to attend this month's expert series talk. I am very pleased to have this month to have Dr. Lowe, who is from Cal State Long Beach. And one of the reasons why I had asked Dr. Lowe to come and join the expert series talk this month is because last week it was Shark Awareness Day. So it was like a nice way for us to be able to celebrate and know a little bit more about sharks, because I know there's a lot of people who may not know a lot about sharks. So it's like a really good way to be able to know more about them. So a little bit more background about Dr. Lowe. So Dr. Lowe has been studying sharks, rays, and bony fish for over 30 years, focusing on their behavior, physiology, and ecology. For the last 15 years, Dr. Lowe and his students have been studying juvenile white sharks off the coast of Southern California using a wide variety of technology. They have found that white sharks use Southern California beaches seasonally as nursery habitats for their youngs. This brings juvenile white sharks in close proximity to beachgoers. Dr. Lowe and his students use a wide array of technologies and educators to help lifeguards and the public understand the mysterious lives of sharks, and just how much of a threat they may actually pose. I also want to add that, Dr. Lowe is very talented and very knowledgeable in sharks. And I'm also very excited every time when Dr. Lowe comes and talks more about sharks. I get very excited about it. And, just to hype up Dr. Lowe and his lab too, in case you guys aren't able to stay the full entire talk, Dr. Lowe is actually doing an outreach program on Saturday, this Saturday at 10 a.m. that is called Sharks at the Beach here at Cal State Long Beach, going from 10 to 3 p.m. So please feel free to come out here and learn more about sharks. There's going to be a lot of activities happening, and not just about sharks, but there's also going to be displays on mammals, insects, chemistry. So if any of you guys have youngsters, it's a great way to bring them on over here. And with that, I will leave it to Dr. Lowe.
Great. Well, thanks, Anita. And it's good to see everybody. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the programs that I'm running at Cal State Long Beach, which is the California Shark Beach Safety Program. And it all started because of this increase in white sharks that we're seeing along our coast. So as many of you probably realize, this next week is Shark Week. You've probably seen more and more shark advertisements to promote that. But in California, we've really been talking more about shark decades, because what we've been seeing in California is a recovery of shark populations. So one of the things that we've learned about white sharks is that their populations were probably overfished due to commercial fishing. So sharks prior to 1994, white sharks in particular, were caught and landed in primarily gillnet fisheries and were sold in fish markets or restaurants. If you ate fish tacos in California prior to 1994, there's a good chance you ate white shark and you didn't know it. So a lot of the juveniles were caught and killed in commercial fisheries. So the population has probably been depressed for well over 100 years. But it's not just fishing that impacted the white shark population. It was loss of adult food. So we have to remember that marine mammals, many of marine mammals in the Pacific, were hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s and really didn't receive protection until the 70s. So it wasn't until 1972 when the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in the US, preventing people from just deliberately killing marine mammals. So what we've seen, and I use California sea lion as an example here, is a dramatic recovery of that population. So if we look at all pinnipeds, seals, sea lions, we see all of them have shown this kind of upward trajectory since their protection in the 70s. And of course, that preceded what we've now seen as an increase in white sharks. So what attributed to this white shark increase was not just protection from fisheries. So in 1994, the state of California passed legislation to protect white sharks from commercial and recreational fishing. But the other thing they did was they passed a gillnet ban that prevented the use of gillnets in nearshore waters from the shoreline out to 3 miles, which is state waters. And believe it or not, that had a major impact on releasing pressure on white sharks. So we think that those two factors are probably the main factors that have allowed white shark population to recover. And the reason why stingrays are here is because juveniles rely very heavily on stingrays, and their populations have gone up mainly because we got rid of all the stingray predators. So as the result, there's protection for sharks, but there's a lot of food for them, which has allowed their populations to recover. So now I say conservation success story, yay, but not everybody cheers. So what we've also learned from working closely with California lifeguards is that over the last 10 years, they have seen a 5-fold increase of white sharks being sighted along the Southern California coastline. In other words, along public beaches. And in addition, we have to remember that in Southern California, we have one of the most heavily populated coastlines in the world. So there are 20 million people that live within 60 miles of the coast. And Southern California is one of those rare places in the United States where people can participate in ocean recreation year round. So as the result, we put a lot of people in the water who are using the ocean for a wide variety of recreation, and that number is increasing. So here's Hermosa Beach on a good summer day, and it's estimated that there can be well over 15,000 people in the water in Santa Monica Bay during the summer on a single day. So in addition to that, you mentioned the word white shark off a public beach, and that used to spur beach closures as a result of safety precautions. So we've seen from lifeguards a pretty significant increase in beach closures as a result of white shark sightings. And those have decreased recently, I think a lot attributed to our new data. But nonetheless, this has economic impacts to communities as well. So despite the fact that we have more sharks along our coast and we have more people going in the water than ever before, what we are not seeing are actually more bites. Now, white sharks are still biting and on rare occasions killing people. But when those events happen and they make national news, it does have economic impacts to these coastal communities. And right now we're trying to figure out how big those impacts are. But nonetheless, it's pretty substantial. Now, our challenge has been working with lifeguards who are constantly encountering these sharks or dealing with the public. And their first question is it safe for people to be in the water if we know there are white sharks off our beaches? And 10 years ago, we couldn't answer that question. So the problem was water safety officials just didn't have sufficient information to make good decisions on whether beaches should be closed or not if white sharks were sighted off beaches. So in 2018, we received funding from the state of California to form the California Shark Beach Safety Program. And that program is a state-funded program. We received $3.75 million to form that, where we expanded our research and then developed an education and outreach program to go with that. So to talk a little bit about what we know about white shark distribution and seasonality. In Southern California, we know that the spring, starting around April through October, is pupping season. And that's when female white sharks come back to the California coastline somewhere and give birth somewhere. And then those babies start showing up off our beaches. In addition, we know from historic fishing data, as well as some of our recent tagging data, that there are nursery hotspots. There are locations where sharks aggregate at these beaches, and they vary over time. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but they range across the entire Southern California coast. So this kind of gives you an idea of some of the locations where we have been tagging juvenile white sharks. And you can see that that covers a lot of the coastline. And it's not just babies, it's also juveniles that use the beaches as kind of nursery habitat. Now, adult white sharks are rarely seen along the Southern California coastline, but more commonly seen around the offshore islands and around the Central California coast, starting in the late summer months through the winter months, because they're attracted to the northern elephant seal rookeries as a place to feed. Now, we know females are coming back in the spring to give birth. We just don't know where, but we rarely see them along the coast. So mainly they're seen around the offshore islands. And then the males come back usually in the late summer, and then they'll feed on northern elephant seals during the winter. And then when the elephant seals leave, those white sharks migrate out to the middle of the Pacific, halfway between California and California and Hawaii. So in order to understand how sharks are using Southern California beaches, we use a variety of technologies in the Shark Lab. So one type of technology we use are called spot tags. So if we catch that shark, we can bolt on this satellite tag on their dorsal fin. And this transmitter only works when it's in the air. It's a powerful radio transmitter, which then sends signals to satellites in orbit, which then will send me an email with a latitude, longitude, time, and date. But the minute that tag goes into water, the transmitter turns off. So these transmitters are designed to stay on the fin for a few years, and eventually the bolts corrode away and it falls off. But the problem with this technology is the sharks have to be at the surface for us to get a position on them. And of course, sharks aren't like marine mammals. They don't have to come to the surface. So we really didn't know how much data we would get using this technology. So the other technology we often pair that with are what are known as pop-off archiving satellite tags. Now these tags that get darted into the shark's back have a temperature, a light, and a depth sensor, and a little computer, and it's logging all those variables to that computer every 30 seconds. And then at a pre-described time and date, that transmitter will pop off the shark, float up to the surface, upload all that data to the satellite, which then downloads it to me in my office. So I get a really accurate temperature and depth record that the shark moved through, and I get a rough geoposition estimate. In other words, the accuracy is about 60 nautical miles. So using this technique, we can really get a better idea of the temperature and depth preferences of these sharks. And we get some idea how far they might have migrated. But if we really want to know how close they are getting to a beach, we use this other technology called acoustic telemetry. So acoustic transmitters use sound waves, which travel really well through seawater. And if we catch the shark, we can surgically implant an acoustic transmitter into the shark's body cavity. And some of those transmitters have a 10-year battery life. Each transmitter has a unique ID code. And when that shark swims within about 300 meters of one of our underwater acoustic receivers that are all along Southern California beaches, the receiver will log the time, the date, and the ID. Now, some of these transmitters, if we can't catch the shark, we can dart into the shark's back. And some of them have temperature and depth sensors. So we can also know the temperature and the depth at the time they're detected by the receiver. The fourth type of technology we use are called smart tags. And these, think of this like a Fitbit for sharks. So if we catch the shark, we can clamp this on the shark's dorsal fin. It has a 3D accelerometer, 3D magnetometer, 3D gyroscope. So it's measuring every motion the shark makes 30 times a second. It also has a video logger on it that points down the shark's nose so we can see what the shark sees. And we can use that to correlate to its body motion. So we can use this thing like a Fitbit to count how many times its tail beat, what was its depth and temperature that it moved through, what was it chasing? Was it chasing prey? Was it avoiding something? And then we can use that 24-hour period, after which it pops off, floats to the surface. We can get that back, and then we can get a really high-resolution idea of what that shark did that day. So by combining all these tools, we're using that to figure out why sharks are using the Southern California beaches. Now, in order to get many of those transmitters on or in those sharks, we have a variety of different techniques. So one way we get sharks are by commercial fishermen that use gill nets. They're fishing outside 3 miles because gill netting inside 3 miles is illegal. And if they accidentally catch a shark, they'll call us up. The students and I will race down to the dock, meet the fishermen there. We can measure the shark. We can take blood samples and tissue samples for genetics. We can fit that shark with a variety of tags, take them offshore and let them go and follow them around. Now, unfortunately, we don't get fishermen catching them very often, or they're too busy to bring the shark in. So they just release the sharks, which they're legally required to do. So we had to get access to sharks ourselves. So a lot of times the sharks are very close to shore, so close to shore that we work with lifeguards to tag them safely. So this gives you an example of how we might tag sharks. So we have a drone spotting for us. And then basically the lifeguards are on a jet ski driving around, and then they see the shark. And then I have a student on the back of the jet ski that rolls into the water. And then we can tag the shark with an external acoustic transmitter. So using this method, we can tag 6 or 7 sharks in a morning. And then of course, our acoustic receivers are about 100 yards off the beach, constantly listening for those tagged sharks. Now for sharks that are a little too large to get in the water with, we can simply tag them from a boat. Or in some cases, we can stick a piece of gill net out while we see the shark swimming, and we can strategically tag or catch that shark. So we can put the net right in front of that individual and entangle it. So by using these methods, it enables us to tag a lot of sharks. So I'm going to show you an animation. This is based on our spot tags. These are the ones that go in the dorsal fin. And what you're going to see is data from 2006 to 2009. And this was funded by Monterey Bay Aquarium. So what you're going to see are the paths that these sharks take. And these are sharks caught in Southern California that typically in the winter months will move all the way down the coast of Baja and sometimes into the Bay of the Sea of Cortez. So here you can see during the summer, sharks are hanging out off Southern California beaches. And then when we get to November, when our water temperatures dip, the baby sharks have a tendency to travel south and will migrate down to this area called Viscount Bay, or in some cases will go all the way down inside the Gulf. So if we want to know how close they're getting to the beaches, we'll use these acoustic receivers. So the acoustic receivers work when a shark swims within about 300 yards of an acoustic receiver, and a diver has to go down and pick these receivers up in order for us to download them. So what you're seeing, all these dots you see are locations of our acoustic receivers all on the coast. We're collaborating with Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary that has an array of acoustic receivers around Channel Islands. We have a bunch of receivers around Catalina. And then, of course, I have colleagues down in Mexico that also have these same receivers that are tagging other species, but we can share data amongst us. So, for example, I have colleagues up in Monterey and all the way up to almost Northern California. And I have colleagues in Mexico that have acoustic receivers. So we've had juvenile white sharks that we've tagged in Southern California that their very first summer will hang out here. And then their first winter will migrate all the way down to Viscount Bay. They may overwinter in Scammons Lagoon, and then the following spring return to Southern California. And then we've had individuals by the time they're 2 years old migrating to the offshore islands, down to Guadalupe, all the way up to Monterey, and then back down to Viscount Bay. So for what we've learned from most of these sharks, based on this vast acoustic receiver array, is that these sharks in their first year can cover on average about 1,600 miles their first year. And that increases their second, third, and fourth as they expand their range. So by the time they're 4 or 5 years old, we've had sharks that have traveled upwards to 4,000 miles in a given year. So one of the other things we've learned using this technology and through some of our tagging is that there are nursery hotspots where we'll find aggregations of juvenile white sharks. And the biggest aggregations we found have up to 40 sharks using about a 2-mile stretch of beach. And what happens is these hotspots come and go. So what we've learned over time is that a hotspot, for example, in 2010 to 2012, the only nursery hotspot we had at that time was Will Rogers Beach. And then that site went cold, and then Manhattan Beach went hot. So from 2013 to 2015, Manhattan Beach was the only hotspot that we had. And then 2015 to 2016, we actually had an aggregation of juvenile white sharks inside Long Beach Harbor at Belmont Shore all summer long, and they would move between Belmont and Surfside. 2017 to 2018, the hotspot was down off Dana Point. And then 2018 to present, actually we have an aggregation off Carpinteria, a very large one, and then another one down off Del Mar, still present, and now Torrey Pines and Coronado. So these hotspots are changing and shifting over time. So using that acoustic monitoring, I'm going to show you another animation. So all the colors you see here, all the different individuals that we had tagged just in 2020. So what you're going to see is a time and date counter here. The different colors represent different individuals, and no, they can't swim across land. Our animation's not smart enough to have them go along the coast. But what you'll notice is in the winter, some of the larger juveniles are staying. They're not migrating in the winter, and they're moving between Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, and the Channel Islands. Once we get into summer and we start tagging smaller juveniles, some of these individuals are staying, and they're staying day and night in this very small area. And then periodically we'll hopscotch between these other hotspot areas. So what we've been able to find is that these sharks, after their first year being at a couple hotspots, know their way around and can rapidly move between those hotspot areas. So the questions we still don't understand is, what makes a hotspot a hotspot? When do they arrive at the hotspots? When do they leave? And do they do this as a group, or are they more antisocial? So one of the other challenges that we have is it takes us about a month to download all the receivers in our array. And we provide all the lifeguards, ocean lifeguards in California, with acoustic detection updates. And one of the problems we had was, because it takes a month, we would go back to lifeguards and we say, oh, by the way, 2 weeks ago, there was an 8-foot white shark off your beach. And they would say, well, thank you, but that's not very helpful. Can we get data faster? So to do that, we teamed up with the manufacturer that makes these transmitters to make these new buoys. They're called live buoys. They have an acoustic receiver right underneath the buoy. These get anchored 100 yards off the beach. You can see one if you walk out to the end of Huntington Beach Pier and you look north, you'll see one of our buoys there. Now these buoys, when a tagged shark gets within 300 yards of the buoy, instead of a diver having to pick it up to download it, now it sends a text message through the cloud to all the lifeguards that are subscribers, and then they will get basically a text alert that they can click on, and that takes them to this website. So what you're seeing here are all the locations of some of our ocean buoys. The green ones indicate locations where there were recent detections. And then each one of these tiles is a tagged animal that was detected. So you can see white sharks. You can see that we have some white shark prey tagged. And basically some of the tags have temperature and depth sensors. So they'll tell you the temperature and the depth that the shark was at the location where it's tagged. So then it gives lifeguards a summary of not only sharks that are tagged and detected at their beach, but also where are they when they're not at their beach. So the lifeguards use this tool basically as a science tool. We've taught them how to interpret the behavioral data so that they can make better decisions on whether they need to close a beach or not. If they click on one of those tiles, think of these like baseball cards, it gives them all the stats of that individual. So for example, it'll tell them the sex of that individual, how big it was, and then they can develop an animation. They can create an animation that will tell them where that shark was detected. So all our ocean lifeguards are using this technology to better decide what to do about sharks off a beach. So we have three hypotheses as to why juvenile white sharks like to stay so close to shore. So we don't know exactly where white sharks are born. We just know that the young ones show up close to our beaches. And because there's no parental care in sharks, any sharks that we know of, these sharks are completely on their own when they're born. So white shark is born between 4 and about 5 feet long, and a female will give birth to anywhere between 2 to 15 babies at a time. So we think the number one reason why they come close to shore is because it's safe. Believe it or not, being in shallow water is a safe place for them. They don't know they're a white shark yet, and they're constantly trying to identify and stay away from predators. And we know that there are very few large adult white sharks along Southern California beaches, and they will eat their young if they're present. So this is a safe place for white sharks to hang out. Now, the other thing that we've realized is that white sharks are endothermic, which means as long as they're swimming, they can keep their bodies warmer than the water. But the babies' bodies are so small, they're not very good at retaining heat. So in many ways, they act like a cold-bodied shark, like an ectothermic shark. So we found that the juveniles, the very small juveniles, are very temperature sensitive. They like warm water. So if you go to the beach, you'll notice that the water is warmer closer to the shoreline than it is 100 yards offshore. So by hanging out in the shallow water, they're actually finding warm water pockets. That'll enable them to grow faster. Now, if they're going to spend weeks to months in these aggregation sites, which we found they do, they have to be eating something. So the number one thing that is most abundant and in the highest biomass along these beaches are stingrays. We have hundreds of thousands of round stingrays off our coastline and lots of bat rays. And we think these are a primary, easy to capture food source for these juveniles that they rely heavily on in these nursery sites. So one of our big questions we want to ask is, how do sharks decide on a site? And then once they pick a site, why this site and not neighboring beaches? So what we found is that sharks aggregate at a particular area where the habitat seems to be very similar, but they're only using this part of the beach. So to answer these questions, we use a variety of tools. So if we had an aggregation of sharks off a beach, what we'll do is we can go out and tag those sharks. We can have an array of acoustic receivers out there. And because these array of acoustic receivers are fairly close, if one of these tagged sharks is detected by 3 or more receivers, we can actually triangulate a position, which means we can track all these different individuals that may be spending weeks to months at this aggregation site and get high resolution data, positional data, on where they are in space and time. Now, the question is, how are they making decisions in that space? So each one of these receivers has a temperature data logger on the seafloor and one on the sea surface. So we can basically calculate the water temperature throughout the entire water column across this entire space. Now, to give you an idea, we're talking about 5 square kilometers of space these sharks are using at a typical aggregation site. To further refine our understanding of the environmental conditions at this site, we also have what is known as an autonomous underwater vehicle. So this is a robot that has an environmental sensor suite on the nose. So it has basically a SON suite. So it's got temperature, depth, chlorophyll, salinity, turbidity, dissolved oxygen. And then we can program this robot to move up and down through this area like a lawnmower, move up and down through the water column, and we can create high resolution 3D maps of all those environmental parameters. And then we can ask, why are the sharks in this area and not in this area or this area? Is it because those environmental variables vary? Now we can fly drones over top of the aggregation sites. We use those to count how many sharks are out there, whether they're tagged or not. And then we can also use them to estimate the size of the sharks and when sharks are in proximity to people. And then, of course, we have some other tools like our smart tags that we can put on the sharks and ask, what are they doing on a day-to-day basis while they're in the aggregation? And then we also can take water samples to measure eDNA. So how much white shark DNA is in the water? How much of their potential prey DNA is in the water? And we can ask, is there more prey here than there is here or here? So I'm going to give you an idea of what some of this high resolution tracking data looks like at an aggregation site. So one of my graduate students, Emily Spurgeon, did this project at Carpinteria, where we had this large aggregation. So here, the yellow dots you see are acoustic receiver locations. And this is about a 2.5 mile stretch of beach. This is the Carpinteria estuary right here. So this is the seafloor temperature mapped with the sharks detections for 1 week. So we tagged 31 sharks at this location. And during this time period, we got over 4 million detections between May 15th and December 9th. And of the 31 tagged sharks at the site, we got 194,000 positions from 25 individuals that we're able to track over this period. So what you're seeing in this animation is 1 week's worth of data. And then what you're also looking at is seafloor temperature here changing by hour. So you can see how dynamic this environment is. So what we've noticed is that there are pockets that warm up. There's a reef right here, and there's another reef here. And you'll see those areas get warmer over the course of the day and over various tides. And you'll notice that sharks are actually moving and using those areas at particular times. This is the first time this has ever been done on this scale, and definitely with white sharks. My computer doesn't like these big animations. So let's give it a second to respond. Okay, so the other thing that we can do is use our autonomous underwater robot to map these areas. So this robot is fairly small, looks like a torpedo, and we can use that to move up and down through the water column so we can create high resolution 3D maps of the environment. So we can run that robot. It takes about 6 hours to map that entire site. And we get that at basically, we get a environmental parameter measure every meter, every cubic meter. So here's our robot out running along at the surface. Here it is making a dive. Here's the path that it follows along that. And as you can see, sharks occasionally actually come over and bite this thing. So in 2021, we had 4 shark bites of our robot. And this is a $250,000 piece of equipment, by the way. The sharks didn't do any serious damage, but it was pretty cool footage to see them do that. So this is what some of the environmental maps look like. So this is at the surface. This is 1 meter, 2, 3, 4, 5, and down to the seafloor. And what you'll notice is that there's a strong thermocline that forms at this area, which means these sharks have thermal options. So for example, if they want to warm up, they hang out at the surface. If they want to cool down, they can go to the seafloor. And by the way, we're talking about probably a 10-degree Fahrenheit difference in temperature between the seafloor and the sea surface. So by using this, we can create these really high resolution maps. So here's a 2D compressed map from the robot data. So what you're seeing is when it's orange or red, that's when the robot was at the surface, that's surface temperature. And when it's blue, that's when the robot was down near the seafloor. So what you can see is in July 31st, 2020, we had 19 sharks that were tagged. We were detecting 14, about 74% of the sharks were detected on that date. So we can see that there's a clear thermocline at this location. By October, the water had warmed up, that's our warm season, and it became uniformly warm. So the thermocline disappeared and the water was warm all the way from top to bottom. And then we get to November and we had a big upwelling event. So we had a strong wind event, we had big upwelling at this site, and the water temperature plummeted. So now we got water temperatures getting down to the 50s. And what was really interesting is that almost all our sharks left within 12 hours of each other, and began to explore for other sites looking for warmer water. By November 21st, the water warmed up again, and some of the sharks actually returned back to the site. So we have the first data showing how sharks are making decisions on when to leave areas just based on water temperature. So we can also use our Fitbits to get a bit more information on what these sharks are doing when they're hanging out at the beach. So if we catch the sharks, we can clamp on our smart tags. And remember, this has a 3D accelerometer, 3D magnetometer. So the magnetometer gives us compass heading. gyroscope tells us whether they're moving up or moving down. And then the accelerometer tells us actual side-to-side movement, pitch, yaw, and acceleration. So we can use that and that's recording that every 30 times a second. It's got a temperature and depth sensor on it, an acoustic transmitter, so we can follow the sharks around and see where they go. So in 2018, we tagged 3 sharks in Belmont Shores with these tags, and we followed them around to see where they go. And what was really interesting is we had a couple sharks exhibit some really interesting behavior. So here's what some of these data look like. So this was basically a first-year shark that was tagged at Belmont Shore. And here you can see the depth. So red is at the surface, blue is near the seafloor. So during the day, the shark's hanging out here off the beach. And then at night, it began to move through, and these are the oil islands. So it's moving around the oil islands. This is its compass heading. Think of this as an activity measure. So where you see red is when the shark is most active. Where you see blue is where it's least active. So you can see where it was deepest, where it was being least active. Here's tail beat amplitude, tail beat frequency, water temperature. So what was really curious is when we got to the tags back, we noticed that the video showed the shark swimming at an angle, 45-degree angle. And then every 20 minutes, it would reverse. They would go at a different angle. So when we looked at the acceleration data and the compass heading data, what we found was the sharks were swimming in a 30-foot diameter circle in a bank like a plane. And they would do that for 20 minutes in one direction. And then would reverse and go the opposite direction for 20 minutes. They reverse again. So they would do this 20-minute reversal for 4 hours. So my grad students were really intrigued by this behavior because 2 of the 3 sharks we tracked exhibited this. So what we found was in the literature, scientists have put little EEG caps on migrating birds. And what some migrating birds will do is will turn off half their brain and will fly in a circle in one direction on autopilot. And that's how they rest. Then they turn off the other half of their brain and fly in a direction in the opposite direction. So they'll do that for a short period of time. And that is how they sleep while they continue to migrate or fly. So we think this might be the first example of how a shark that must continuously swim in order to breathe may actually sleep. So this is known as unihemispheric sleep. Dolphins, whales, even migratory birds are known to do this, but no sharks have ever been demonstrated to do this. And we think this might provide some of the first tantalizing data of how a white shark might actually rest. So one of the other questions we want to address is how often are sharks and people together at the same time? So one of my graduate students, Patrick Rex, conducted a 2-year survey study using drones, flying surveys along all these beaches, 26 public beaches across Southern California. And by using drones, he could fly along the beach, and we could use that video to count how many people are in the water and what activities they're participating in, measure their distance from the shoreline and from the wave break, and then measure their distances from any sharks that we saw in the surveys. So Patrick conducted over 1,000 surveys, his data are old, and in covering almost 300 survey days, ended up with 700 hours of footage to process. So by doing this, Patrick has been able to quantify where sharks are along the coast, when they're in proximity to people, and what they're doing when they're in proximity to people. So this is what some of the survey footage looks like. And remember, drones have really high resolution compasses on them. They have GPS, they know the altitude, and we know their speed. So this is what some of the video footage will look like. If I can get my computer to read the file. There we go. Maybe. There we go. So you can see the shoreline in view, you can see all the people, and then we can correlate all these environmental variables for each beach that he surveyed. So because this racked up lots and lots of video, we teamed up with computer scientists and engineers to develop machine learning algorithms to help us identify all these objects. So I had undergraduate students that took frame by frame and went through and said, that's a surfer, that's a wader, that's a swimmer, that's a stand-up paddleboarder, that's a shark. So we used about 5,000 images to train the software to identify these objects. And then it was really easy to program to measure the distance from the shoreline and from the wave break. So using these data, some of the things Patrick found was, for example, this is the wave break, and waders are inside the wash. Anything in this direction is inside the wash. Anything outside here is outside the wave break. So what you'll notice is that waders and bodyboarders are typically inside the wave break. But sharks are typically located about 50 to 100 meters outside the wave break. That's where their major distribution is, and which more corresponds with stand-up paddleboarders, surfers when they're waiting in the lineup, and then to a certain degree, swimmers. So by using these data for the first time, we've been able to quantify how often people and sharks are in the water together at the same time. One of the other things that Patrick found was that at aggregation sites were the only places where he saw people and sharks together every single day. In fact, 97% of the days he surveyed, he saw white sharks in close proximity to people. In fact, in some cases, swimming right underneath people, and those people didn't even know the sharks were present. So at those beaches during the time of our study, there were no bites. So for the first time, we've been able to quantify the fact that people and sharks, white sharks, are together in the water every single day at certain locations, and no one's being bitten. So this is an example of what some of those encounters look like. So this is Carpinteria. So the blue indicates where he saw people. The red indicates where he saw sharks. And all these dots indicate the locations of actual shark sightings from his drone surveys. And you'll notice there's a big cluster in the same area where there were people. Now, what's really interesting about this is that there are only 2 beach access sites at this location, right here and right here. That's it. So basically that dictates where people spend most of their time. Most people he found were not willing to walk more than 200 meters from a beach access point. This is Del Mar Beach. So again, here we have humans in blue and sharks in red. Here's my pointer. There we go. And all the triangles are locations of sharks. But we have beach access points here, 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 here. Now there's a rocky reef here, which we think the sharks are really focusing on. That's why all their activity is primarily focused here. But that also creates good surf. So as a result, we have high shark-human overlap in these areas. So by using drones, we've been able to identify when sharks and people overlap and actually can come up with forecasts, like when are people most likely going to encounter sharks and under what conditions. So this gives you an example of what some of that footage will look like. And then Patrick's working on a second study right now, classifying the angle, direction, and speed of the shark relative to people in the water. And does that dictate whether the sharks are more likely to approach, avoid, or ignore? So far, some of the preliminary data show that white sharks basically ignore people. So we have people interacting with sharks a lot more. We have sharks aggregating at these beaches. And despite the fact that they are legally protected, we do have new conservation issues. So for example, we now have situations where fishers, recreational fishers, are deliberately going out and targeting sharks at these beaches. There have been a lot of examples, more so in recent years, of fishers actually going out and deliberately targeting sharks. They claim they're catching and releasing, which is not illegal. We just don't know whether the sharks they drag up from the beach, take a picture of and release, survive. So again, we don't know the impact this might have on the sharks that are using these areas. In addition, we have situations where some of these fishers are chumming at public beaches to draw the sharks in to catch them. And it was prior to January 1st, it was not illegal to chum at a public beach. In some cases, we had fishers putting 200 pounds of ground up tuna chum in the water at a public beach where kids were surfing and swimming. And unfortunately, the cities couldn't do anything about it because it wasn't illegal according to Fish and Game rules. Recently, they've been citing those fishers for illegal discharge because they're putting so much chum in the water. We've also had situations of unregulated tourism. So where these aggregations occur, we had situations where boat operators were taking people out to see the sharks. And while that's not a bad thing, there are no rules for how they should operate. Unlike whale watching that has really strict rules, there are no rules for how they can operate around sharks. And because these sharks are very close to the beach, quite often they're chasing the sharks around. In some cases, they're throwing bait to lure the sharks closer so people could take pictures. And that could put people who are water users in the water at those locations at risk. And in addition, there's new legislation that was actually just passed as of January 1st that makes many of these things illegal. Yet, despite the fact that it's illegal, we still see it going on. In fact, last week, we had fishers illegally catching and landing white sharks. And unfortunately, the wardens aren't able to do much about it. Our other goal of our program, in addition to research, has been outreach. So we have something called Shark Shacks. These go to public beaches. I employ about a dozen undergraduates. I have an education director who runs this program and trains all the students. So we hit about 36 public beaches many times each summer. We move all the way from San Diego to Santa Barbara. We hit many of the ocean piers. We do many special events. We engage about 17,000 people per year. So every summer we've done this, and every summer it gets more and more popular. In addition, we have a comic book series that we developed for kids, one on beach safety, one on marine pollution, and one we call Shark Spies that's out. These are available online. You can access these on the Shark Lab webpage. So if you just type in Shark Lab comic books, it'll take you to the website, and you can click on any of the covers, and then you can read the comic book. And we have them in both English and in Spanish, although the newest book isn't in Spanish yet. So the goal is there. We've printed 50,000 copies of these in paper, which I hate, but we've already distributed them. The kids absolutely love them. And we're probably gonna have to do another printing because we're almost out. My education director has developed a K-12 program we call Operation STEM Bait, Sharks and Robots. And this basically has several grades. We use Cal State Long Beach students, biology, physics, math, and engineering undergraduates to help teach their curriculum. We have it for both virtual and in school. And then we have different levels in which we can target students, where we engage students using sharks and technology to get them interested in STEM fields. So right now we're seeking additional funding to support this program because our goal is to send our students to schools as far away as Santa Barbara and San Diego for this program, and inland as well. This program is free to schools. We do not want to charge. So we're looking for funding to support that so we can pay our students to go out and deliver this curriculum. In addition, we have a lifeguard education program. In Southern California, we have some of the best trained lifeguards in the world, but they are not marine biologists. So when a surfer comes out of the water and says, I think I just saw a shark, the lifeguards have to investigate. And quite often they don't have the skills to identify those animals. So we've worked with all the ocean lifeguards in California to develop a training program for them that helps them identify various types of marine life, helps them to identify shark behavior. So we use a lot of our drone footage to teach them how to tell whether a shark is being aggressive or not. And then that information is then used to decide whether they should pull people out of the water. So in addition, we produce lots of infographics that we share with lifeguards. So this is a great example. We show this to lifeguards. This is an example of a very chilled out white shark. So if a surfer comes out and says, I just saw a white shark like this swimming by, and the lifeguard says, well, how was it swimming? They said very slowly, it just kind of went by. There's nothing to worry about. That shark is not exhibiting any signs of aggression. We have a fisher education program because not all fishers are deliberately going out and trying to catch white sharks. Some of them incidentally catch them. So we teach them how to identify sharks, how to identify areas where white sharks might be, how to avoid catching them, safe release practices. And now we're developing signage for coastal piers and beaches. And we're working with Cal Fish and Game to develop new regulations to help keep people and sharks safe along the beaches. So we have a couple of PSA videos that are available online. If you scan this QR code, you can see one of our shark safety videos. So one of the other challenges we have with our outreach is we don't know what messages are working. So I teamed up with a psychologist at Cal State Long Beach, Dr. Gabby Hancock, who specializes in the psychology of fear. And she helped us develop a survey to evaluate people's perceptions of sharks and other marine wildlife. So far, she's gathered over 600 surveys from people across the country, across a wide demographic. And we just published a new paper on people's perceptions of sharks and stingrays. That's brand new out. That just came out last week. So we're using that information to understand how sharks perceive sharks. And we can use that information to decide how to adequately change their minds about sharks. In other words, how well does our education and outreach message to change people's perceptions? So we're using the psychology study to know what our baseline is. So then we can ask, how effective is our messaging in actually changing people's perceptions? In addition, I've teamed up with another professor at Cal State Long Beach who specializes in ecotourism. So she's in rec and leisure studies, and she's been doing intercept surveys at our shark shacks, primarily for people that are visiting California from other places. They're tourists. And she's asking them questions about their knowledge of why they're picking a certain beach, what they intend to do at that beach, what are the things they look for at a beach, and if they knew there were white sharks at that beach, would they still allow their kids to go in the water? So during that interviews, she's basically been able to get a lot of really interesting information. So from some of the free response, these are all the dislikes. And if you all know how word clouds work, the bigger the word, the more frequently people mention that. So obviously the dislikes are people and crowds and homeless and trash and bathrooms and all those sorts of things. And you'll notice here that, stingrays occur, but stingrays are fairly small. So stingrays are in the dislike category, but in the like category, look how big sharks are. So one of the things she found was that some people actually told her that they knew there were white sharks at that beach, and they were actually going to that beach with the hopes of actually seeing one. So when we present this information to city councils, they're actually very intrigued by these data because it shows that the fact that there are white sharks off our beaches and it makes national news isn't necessarily affecting beach tourism. Lastly, I've teamed up with an environmental economist who's helping us understand what are the economic impacts from shark bites and beach closures. So because we know those economic impacts can be substantial, we want to know what that economic impact is and how big it is. So for example, we know that a shark bite can occur somewhere in Southern California, and that months later, people who are from Kansas may not know their geography very well, will associate an area 100 miles north with the area where the bite occurred. So we know that there are economic impacts that span more than just the community where that bite occurred. So that's never been done. It's never been measured in the US. So our goal is to use this study to understand what are the economic impacts. So far, some of the preliminary data suggests that at minimum, closing a beach can cost a community $100,000 a day. So imagine what that would be if you had a shark bite and that made national news. So we have lots of research partners. Most of our funding comes from the state of California. I've managed to stretch our $3.75 million 6 years, but our funding ends in June. We're hoping to get re-upped by the state for another 6 years to keep this program running. Monterey Bay Aquarium was the one that started us in this research. AltaSea has also provided funds, and we have lots of small private donors, and we hope to build on that. We have lots of educational and research partners. And then, of course, we work with every single beach city in Southern California and county, and they all contribute on total about $200,000 a year in in-kind support. So for every $3 we spend each year from the state, the cities and counties are kicking in $1. So we think this has been a very productive program, and one that has probably saved the state of California already millions of dollars as a result of not lost revenue because of the education information and the things that we're learning about white sharks off our beaches. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. I guess I will take the floor with if anyone has any questions for Dr. Lowe. You guys could either, unmute yourself or put it in the chat. And then Kim was here, but she had to leave, and she said, "Thank you for your talk."
Okay.
So one of the questions I have and kind of curious about, like with all the outreach that you've had, have you had people like come back and be like, "Hey, like I have a different perspective about sharks now, like I'm teaching other people about like sharks and safety about sharks." And like how many people do you think are more knowledgeable because of that?
So that's a great question, and we don't have good data on that. So yes, we have a lot of anecdotes, right, of people saying, "Oh yeah, this information's been great. I look at sharks differently." What we're going to do is we're going to redo that survey next year. And then hopefully that will tell us how much we've moved the needle, right? Because we now have a spectrum of perceptions. And now through our education, our goal is to actually try to see how well that all that outreach information has moved the needle. So that drone study that I was talking about, that made international news, and that keeps getting news. And we think the drone footage is probably the most powerful outreach tool we have for convincing people that they're out there swimming and a white shark may swim by them and nothing bad's going to happen to them. So what we need to identify is what's working outreach wise and what isn't. And that's where we're using the psychology surveys and social surveys to evaluate that.
Okay, thank you. Thea, I see your hand raised.
That was a great talk. I have tons of questions, but narrow it down. So when you were saying that if a shark swimming by slowly, kind of like back and forth, is a non-aggressive behavior, like what would, if you saw a white shark in a lineup, like when would you get out? When are you passing it, you know?
So we have seen signs of aggression, but we've never seen it with a person. We've seen sharks act aggressively to other sharks. So there's a pecking order at these aggregation sites. So bigger sharks and smaller sharks interact. And we've seen bigger sharks act aggressively towards smaller ones. And that's how we say we think this is aggressive behavior. So basically what they do is they accelerate really rapidly towards the animal, and then they'll move away. And then they'll circle and they'll come in again really aggressively and then move away. And then they'll keep doing that. And usually the smaller individual will just take off. So those are the ways we begin to understand what that body language looks like and what those signals look like, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it feels very familiar, kind of like horses or like, you know, any kind of large animal like that. That's not really going in attacking right away, just like making aggressive behaviors, I guess.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you have to remember that many of these juveniles aren't feeding on mammals yet. They're still too young and immature for that. So they're feeding on fish. So big targets tend to be scary targets, even people. But we do have juveniles up to 9 feet long that are at beaches that are in some cases bigger than a surfer, right? On a board. And they still act kind of that way if they don't just ignore people.
Well, that's interesting too. Like, at what point are they an adult?
Yeah, so males mature somewhere around 10 or 11 feet, and probably at around 10 or 11 years old. Females don't mature until they're after 12 feet long and probably 14 to 18 years old. Wow. So we generally don't see that size. After 9 feet, they tend to disappear using the aggregation sites. And we don't really know a lot about teenage white sharks. We know quite a bit about adults. We know a lot about the juveniles. We really know nothing about the teenagers. They don't tend to hang out at the aggregation sites.
Huh. And then, so nobody knows anything about how they're born? Like, I mean, I did a basic question, which I could just look up, but I still am just gonna ask you, do they have live birth, or are they?
They do. No, they do have live birth. They have a very interesting reproduction. So, females probably mate with more than one male, and then they'll incubate these eggs, right, internally. So they have an egg with a yolk, and then the yolk is used up and the embryo is only about 6 inches long. And then the yolk's gone. So the way the females continue to nurse them is she'll ovulate more eggs. And then the embryos will eat those eggs that she ovulates into the uterus. So their embryos are just swimming around, gobbling down eggs. And they get these big giant Buddha bellies full of yolky eggs that they use to grow till about 2 feet long. And then the remaining part of their pregnancy, when she stops ovulating eggs, the inside of her uterus becomes very fuzzy, like a shag carpet. And then she secretes a glycoprotein that the embryos drink. And it almost looks like buttermilk. It's super lipid rich. And that's how they finish off their pregnancy. Basically, they finish off development at about 4 feet long, and then they're born live. Now, we don't know where they give birth. We really don't know anything about that part. So that part's still a mystery. Everything we know about reproduction in white sharks comes from about a dozen pregnant females that have been examined.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, thank you.
Calvin?
Yeah, so I had a question of, you mentioned that the sharks, the juvenile sharks have seem to be showing some temperature dependency, where it seems to make intuitive sense because, as the larger the individual, the more thermal inertia they would have, right? Did you happen to notice any sort of pattern between some of the smaller juveniles and the larger juveniles in terms of their temperature dependency? Like, does their dependency start to kind of trail off as they get a little bit larger?
Yeah, I'd say after 100 kilos, they're more endothermic. So for example, after they're about 2 years old, when they're about 7 to 8 feet long, they don't have to migrate south in the winter. They can tolerate our winter temperatures. And of course, the 8 and 9 footers can stay, and they can go north of Point Conception. So I'd say after about 100 kilos, they're fully functional endotherms at that point.
Okay. Carly, you have your hand raised?
Hi, yes. I did have a question. Well, I had lots of things that I was interested in, but I specifically was curious about this sleep pattern that you may have found. Yeah, so I'm not too sure how you would even go about figuring out how, if they are actually sleeping, how long that they're sleeping for, since they are younger, and if they are doing it around these beaches, if most of the time they are kind of like resting.
That's a great question, and it's one that I constantly think about. What would be really cool would be a little brain cap, like they have for the migrating birds with the EEGs, and then we could measure brain activity. That would probably require us trying to keep a white shark in captivity, rather than try to do that in the field. That would be really hard to do in the field, but not entirely impossible. So, but that would be what we'd require to demonstrate that they experience unihemispheric sleep.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. Carly beat me to that question.
Great, thank you for that.
I had a question about like the temperature. Especially like the juveniles are always trying to go to like the warmer temperatures. Like, how do they know where that temperature, like those beaches are? Like, it's kind of like a mystery to me.
Yes, so we know that many of the beaches share very similar thermal characteristics. So in other words, they're probably not picking a beach just based on its thermal characteristics, because there are many beaches that share that. There's something else. It's either food abundance or there's some social component to it. In other words, you get a bunch of sharks hanging out at the same site, that attracts more sharks. So we don't know how much of this is environmentally related, how much of this may be related to social interactions. They don't like to be right next to each other. They tolerate each other, but there almost seems like they still hang out together. Like, I know it's a safe place and there's food here if there are other juvenile white sharks around. But the one unique thing that we see about temperature, and this is where Emily Spurgeon's thesis really demonstrated, is that over that 5 square kilometer area, animals are making decisions on environmental conditions probably in a 30-meter bubble around them. In other words, they're constantly moving and evaluating things and asking, is this warmer or colder, warmer or colder? And then they're choosing these thermal envelopes within those areas. And remember, these areas that are highly dynamic, they're constantly changing, and there's cells of warm and cold moving. And these animals seem to be able to make decisions on where they want to be. So coming back to your question, Anita, I think there's more to it than just having the favorite water temperature. I think it has to do with food. I think it has to do with social interactions and possibly some other cue that we're not even on our radar.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Dr. Chuck that says, are the populations in SoCal to Guadalupe different from those at the, I'm probably going to butcher this, Faralloons? And is their behavior the same in NorCal?
So the genetics that's been done shows both mitochondrial and nuclear genetics show that it's all one population of white shark in the Northeast Pacific. So the ones in the Farallones, the ones in Guadalupe, the ones in the Sea of Cortez, the ones in Hawaii are all genetically part of the same population. It's one population. However, the genetics, there's been a genetic study looking at pups in Southern California and pups in Baja, and then adults at the Farallones and adults at Guadalupe. And it turns out about probably 40% of the pups in Southern California more closely match genetic patterns from females from Guadalupe than they do females from the Farallones. So interestingly enough, it seems like that the Guadalupe adults may be contributing more to our pups than the few females that have been seen in the Farallones, which may not be surprising because there are more females seen at Guadalupe than the feral ones. In terms of behavior, the sharks behave. So we have colleagues in Mexico that are studying the nurseries down in Mexico, and those sharks seem to act very similar to the ones in Southern California, but Mexico has those massive lagoons, which we do not. And it looks like the sharks use those lagoons quite a bit. So Scammons Lagoon, probably Magdalena Bay, they're using many of those areas as kind of winter habitats or summer habitats for the ones that are born there.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any more questions for Dr. Lowe? Okay, so if there isn't any other questions, thank you again, Dr. Lowe. Definitely a very interesting talk, and definitely learned a lot more about sharks. And just like a small reminder, if you guys are free on Saturday, just stop by Cal State Long Beach for for Sharks at the Beach. You get to learn a little bit more about sharks, have a fun shark activities and other activities as well. And I hope I get to see you guys next month for our next expert series with PJ Torres. And thank you. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your night.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks for the talk, Chris.
Okay, bye-bye.